He was just a single dad trying to find a good seat at the school play, but when the woman in the front row turned around, he had no idea she owned the entire building and his life was about to change forever. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? The auditorium smelled of floor polish, dust, and the faint, sugary scent of cheap perfume from the woman 2 rows ahead. Liam Calloway shifted in the squeaking plastic chair, trying to stretch his legs in the cramped space without bumping the knees of the man behind him. He tugged at the collar of his flannel shirt, a familiar garment worn soft at the elbows, the only clean one he had that didn't have a faint stain of wood glue on the cuff. He felt out of place, a rough-hewn figure in a sea of pressed khakis and polite smiles. But none of that mattered. His eyes were fixed on the stage, a wide, hopeful grin plastered on his face as the heavy red curtain twitched, threatening to open. His daughter, Maya, was in that play. She was tree number 3, a role she'd practiced with a solemn dedication that both broke his heart and filled it to bursting. He'd spent the last 3 nights helping her paint branches onto a cardboard costume, his large, calloused hands surprisingly gentle as he guided her smaller ones. He knew every one of her 2 lines by heart. He'd mouthed them with her in the car on the way over, their old truck rattling with a rhythm that had become the soundtrack to their lives. The lights dimmed. A hush fell over the crowd, a collective breath held in anticipation. Liam leaned forward, his back straight, his focus absolute. This was for Maya. This moment of her standing on a stage, bathed in light, was more important than the overdue notice from the landlord tucked in his wallet, more important than the fact that his workshop had been silent for a week, more important than the gnawing loneliness that sometimes settled in his chest late at night. In the front row, Catherine Vale felt a familiar wave of detached boredom wash over her. She'd attended a dozen of these things charity recitals, donor appreciation nights, the groundbreaking for this very auditorium. They were all the same. Stiff smiles, awkward speeches, and the cloying need for approval. Her nephew, a boy she barely knew, was a sheep in the 3rd act. Her attendance was a line item on her schedule, a necessary performance of familial duty and corporate benevolence. Her company's name was on a bronze plaque in the lobby. She'd paid for the lights, the sound system, the very seats these people were sitting in, yet she felt no connection to any of it. It was all just a transaction. She smoothed a non-existent wrinkle from her silk blouse, her fingers brushing the cool, heavy weight of the watch on her wrist. Then, her gaze drifted. It swept over the rows of parents, their phones held aloft, and landed on him. He was in the back, but he sat with an intensity that pulled her focus like a magnet. He wasn't filming. He wasn't whispering to a spouse. He was utterly, completely present. His worn clothes seemed out of place, but his expression was one of pure, unadulterated joy. He leaned forward, his entire being aimed at the stage, and she watched as a slow, proud smile spread across his face. It wasn't for her, not for anyone else. It was for a child on that stage. And in that moment, watching this stranger, Catherine Vale, a woman who had everything, felt a pang of something she hadn't felt in years. A deep, profound, and painful envy. The play was a chaotic, charming mess of forgotten lines and wobbly set pieces. Maya delivered her 2 lines with the gravity of a seasoned Shakespearean actor. "The forest is quiet today," and "Oh look, a squirrel," before resuming her stoic, tree-like posture. Liam's chest swelled with a pride so fierce it almost hurt. He clapped louder than anyone when the curtain finally fell, his hands stinging, his face aching from smiling. As the lights came up and the crowd began to shuffle out, a wave of tiny, costumed children flooded the aisles. Liam stood, his eyes scanning the sea of papier-mâché animals, and felt capes until he saw her. Maya, still in her cardboard branches, her face flushed with triumph. She launched herself into his arms, and he lifted her up, her light weight a familiar and precious burden. "Did you see me, Daddy? Did you see me?" she asked, her voice breathless with excitement. "I saw you, Sprout," he whispered into her hair, which smelled like hairspray and the dusty backstage area. You were the best tree in the whole forest, the most magnificent tree I've ever seen." She giggled, burying her face in his neck. "I wasn't nervous. Not even a little bit." "I know you weren't," he said, his voice thick, with an emotion he rarely let surface. "You were brave, and you were wonderful." He set her down, and she immediately began chattering about the backstage drama, how one of the sheep had tripped and the son had almost fallen over. Catherine watched them from a few feet away. Her own nephew, having already been whisked away by his parents, with a brief, distracted nod in her direction. She was supposed to be leaving. Her driver was waiting, but she found herself unable to move. The interaction between the man and his daughter was so raw, so genuine, it felt like she was eavesdropping on something sacred. It was a world away from her own, a world of hand-sewn costumes and fierce, unconditional love that wasn't tied to a stock price or a public image. Maya, in her excitement, spun around, and a small folded program slipped from her cardboard branch. It fluttered to the ground, landing near the toe of Catherine's sleek leather boot. Before she could think, Catherine bent down and picked it up. The paper was simple, photocopied, with a crooked drawing of a forest on the cover. She held it for a moment, then stepped forward. "Excuse me," she said, her voice softer than she intended. "I think you dropped this." Liam turned, and for the first time their eyes met. His were a deep, tired blue, but they held a warmth that surprised her. He looked at her, then at the program, then back at her face, a flicker of guarded confusion crossing his features. He was taking in her expensive coat, her poised demeanor, the quiet air of authority that clung to her no matter how she tried to hide it. "Oh, thanks," he said, taking the program from her. His fingers brushed hers, and the contrast was stark as skin, rough and calloused, hers smooth and manicured. For a second, the space between them crackled with the unspoken chasm of their different worlds. "You were great," Catherine said to Maya, offering a small, genuine smile. "A very convincing tree." Maya beamed. "Thanks. My dad helped with the branches." Liam gave a tight, polite nod, his hand resting protectively on Maya's shoulder. "Well, have a good night," he said, his tone a clear but gentle dismissal. He was already turning away, guiding his daughter toward the exit, retreating back into the safety of his own world. He didn't know it yet, but Catherine Vale wasn't a woman who was easily dismissed, especially not when she'd just glimpsed something she'd long ago stopped believing was real. Liam didn't think about the woman from the play again. Not really. The memory of her was a fleeting imagia, polished coat, a quiet voice, eyes that seemed to see a little too much. But life had a way of pushing such things aside with the more pressing realities of rent and empty cupboards. The next morning, he was at his workshop, a converted garage behind a row of tired-looking storefronts. The air smelled of sawdust, varnish, and the bitter scent of old coffee. Liam ran a hand over a half-finished tabletop, the grain of the reclaimed oak smooth beneath his calloused palm. This was his sanctuary, a place where he could take broken things and make them whole again. He'd built a reputation for honest work, fair prices. But lately, the calls had slowed. Big-box stores were cheaper, faster. People didn't value craftsmanship the way they used to. He was currently restoring a set of antique chairs for a client who was already 2 weeks late on the deposit. He couldn't afford to buy the stain he needed to finish the job, a fact that sat like a stone in his gut. "Dad, can we get hot chocolate?" Maya's voice came from the small office space he'd set up for her in the corner, a desk cluttered with crayons, glitter, and half-finished drawings. He looked over. She was holding up one of his empty mugs, a hopeful look on her face. He checked his wallet, $7 and some change. Enough for 2 hot chocolates and maybe a donut to split. But it was also his gas money for the rest of the week. "How about you be the boss of the hot chocolate station at home later?" He countered, forcing a cheerfulness he didn't feel. "You can use the special marshmallows." Her face fell for a second, then brightened again. "Okay, with extra whipped cream." "You got it, boss." He turned back to the chairs, the weight of that simple request heavier than the wood he was working with. He just wanted to give her one small thing, one worry-free moment, but even that felt like a luxury he couldn't afford. A sleek black car, the kind that whispered of money and quiet power, pulled up in front of the workshop. Liam barely noticed it, assuming it was someone lost or turning around. Then the door opened and she stepped out. The woman from the play, Catherine. She stood on the cracked pavement for a moment, looking at the faded sign above his door. Callaway Woodworks. Her expression unreadable. She wore a simple cashmere sweater and jeans, but even in casual clothes, she looked like she belonged in a different universe. Liam's stomach tightened. He wiped his hands on a rag, a nervous, instinctive gesture. The bell above the door chimed softly as she stepped inside, bringing a gust of cold air and the faint, clean scent of expensive perfume. "Hi again," she said, her eyes taking in the organized chaos of his workshop. She didn't look disgusted or surprised, just curious. "I was, in the neighborhood. My nephew mentioned his classmate's dad was a carpenter." It was a weak excuse, and they both knew it. "Yeah, that's me," Liam said, his voice flat. He leaned against his workbench, creating a physical barrier between them. "What can I do for you?" She walked a little farther in, her boots clicking softly on the concrete floor. She ran a finger along the edge of the tabletop he'd been sanding. "This is beautiful." "It's a table," he said, shrugging. "No, it's more than that," she insisted, her gaze meeting his. "It has a story. You can feel it." Liam didn't know what to say. People didn't talk about his work that way. They talked about price, turnaround time, durability. They didn't talk about stories. Maya chose that moment to emerge from her office, holding a drawing. "Look, it's the fancy lady!" Catherine laughed, a genuine, unguarded sound that caught Liam off guard. "I suppose I am," she said, kneeling to look at Maya's drawing. "And who is this handsome fellow?" "That's my dad," Maya said proudly. "He can fix anything." Catherine looked up at Liam, a soft, unreadable smile on her face. And in that moment, under the dusty, fluorescent lights of his failing workshop, Liam felt a crack in the careful wall he'd built around his heart. It was small, barely a hairline fracture, but it was there. Catherine didn't stay long. She'd commissioned a small piece, a custom-made bookshelf, paying the deposit in cash with bills so crisp they looked like they'd never been touched. The amount was more than enough to cover the materials, the overdue stain for the chairs, and gas for the next month. Liam tried to refuse, insisting the deposit was too high, but she was firm. "Consider it an investment in quality," she'd said, her eyes holding his, daring him to argue. He didn't. After she left, the workshop felt both fuller and emptier. The scent of her perfume lingered in the air, a stark contrast to the familiar smell of wood and dust. The crisp bills sat on his workbench, a silent testament to the chasm between their worlds. He told himself it was just a job, a lucky break, but he couldn't shake the feeling that it was something more. He hadn't missed the way she'd looked around his shop, not with pity, but with a kind of quiet longing. He hadn't missed the way her smile, a practiced, polite thing at first, had become real when she spoke to Maya. Over the next week, a strange, unspoken routine began. Catherine would stop by the workshop, always under a plausible pretext. She needed to check on the progress of the bookshelf. She had a question about the type of wood. She was in the area and thought she'd say hello. Each time, she'd bring something small, a box of fancy cookies for Maya, a thermos of coffee that tasted infinitely better than his own burnt brew. Liam remained guarded, his conversations with her polite but distant. He kept his hands busy, sanding, measuring, letting the work be a shield. He didn't want to need her kindness. He didn't want to get used to the way her presence seemed to brighten the dusty corners of his life. But Maya had no such reservations. She adored Catherine. She'd show her every new drawing, tell her every secret, and drag her into the office to help with important glitter-related projects. Catherine, for her part, seemed to thrive on it. Liam would watch from a distance as this powerful, elegant woman sat cross-legged on the concrete floor, her expensive jeans getting dusty, listening with rapt attention as Maya explained the complex social dynamics of her stuffed animals. One afternoon, Catherine arrived as Liam was struggling with a heavy slab of maple. He was trying to maneuver it onto his workbench, his muscles straining, his jaw tight with frustration. "Need a hand?" she asked from the doorway. He was about to say no, his pride bristling, but the wood slipped, and he grunted with the effort of catching it. Before he could protest, she was there, her hands finding a hold on the opposite end. "On 3, she said, her voice calm and steady. 1, 2, 3. Together they lifted it, the weight suddenly manageable. They settled it onto the workbench, their shoulders brushing. Liam was breathing heavily, his heart pounding from the exertion and her proximity. "Thanks," he muttered, not meeting her eyes. "I had it." "I know," she said softly, her hand lingering on the wood. "But you don't have to do everything alone." He finally looked at her. The air between them was thick with sawdust and unspoken feelings. Her face was flushed, her hair slightly disheveled. She looked real, not like the polished woman from the play, but like someone who wasn't afraid to get her hands dirty. He saw the loneliness in her eyes, the same quiet ache he sometimes saw in his own reflection. And he realized, with a jolt of something that felt terrifyingly like hope, that he didn't want her to leave. He wanted her to stay, right here, in the beautiful, dusty chaos of his life. The bookshelf was finished. Liam had put more of himself into it than any project in years. The joints seamless, the finish smooth as glass. It was a masterpiece of quiet craftsmanship, a physical representation of the fragile, unspoken thing that had grown between them. Catherine came to pick it up on a crisp autumn afternoon. The leaves outside were the color of fire, and the sunlight slanted through the workshop windows, illuminating the floating dust in golden shafts. When she saw the bookshelf, she stopped, her breath catching. She ran a hand over the top, her touch reverent. "Liam," she whispered, "it's perfect." "It's what you asked for," he said, shrugging, though a current of pride ran through him. "It's more," she said, her eyes meeting his. "Thank you." They loaded it into her car together, the silence between them comfortable now, familiar. The pretense of their meetings had fallen away, leaving something quieter and more honest in its place. As he closed the trunk, Catherine hesitated. "I have 2 tickets to the Botanical Gardens Light Festival tonight," she said, her voice a little too casual. "My nephew canceled. I was wondering if Maya would like to go." Liam knew she wasn't asking just for Maya. The invitation hung in the air, a delicate, hopeful thing. Part of him, the old, cautious part, wanted to say no, to retreat back into the safety of his predictable world. But then he thought of Maya's face, of the way it lit up whenever Catherine was around. And he thought of his own, of how the world had seemed a little less gray since she'd walked into it. "I think she'd love that," he said. And the smile she gave him was brighter than any light festival. The gardens were a wonderland of color and light. Trees were wrapped in shimmering blues and greens, pathways glowed with soft amber, and intricate sculptures made of light seemed to float on the dark ponds. Maya ran ahead, a small, joyful silhouette against the dazzling backdrop, her laughter echoing in the cool night air. Liam and Catherine walked a few paces behind, their hands brushing occasionally, sending small jolts of electricity through him. "This is incredible," Liam said, his voice full of genuine awe. He was used to the beauty of wood grain, of natural, earthy things. This man-made magic was a different language entirely. "It's one of the charities my family's foundation supports," Catherine said, then immediately seemed to regret it, as if she'd broken a spell. Liam stopped. "Your family's foundation?" She looked away, her hands tucking into the pockets of her long wool coat. "My father started it years ago. It's complicated." Before he could ask what she meant, Maya came running back, her cheeks flushed, her eyes wide. "There's a wishing tree. You write a wish on a ribbon and tie it to a branch? Can we do it? Please?" They followed her to a massive, ancient oak, its branches laden with thousands of colorful ribbons fluttering in the breeze. Catherine bought 3 ribbons sewn red, 1 blue, 1 gold. Maya scribbled her wish with intense concentration. "I wish for a puppy," and tied it to a low-hanging branch. Liam wrote his simply, "For Maya to always be this happy," and added it beside hers. He glanced over at Catherine. She stood for a long moment, the golden ribbon in her hand, her expression unreadable. Then she slowly wrote something, folded it so he couldn't see, and tied it high on a branch, just out of reach. She didn't tell him what she wished for. She didn't have to. As they walked away, under the canopy of 1,000 silent wishes, she tentatively slipped her hand into his. Her fingers were cold, but her grip was firm. Liam's heart stuttered, then settled. He laced his fingers with hers, accepting the silent offering, and for the first time in a very long time, he didn't feel like he was walking alone. The spell of the Light Festival lingered for days. The memory of Catherine's hand in his, the shared laughter, the quiet comfort of her presence, it all settled into a warm place in Liam's chest. He found himself thinking of her at odd times, smiling to himself while sanding a piece of wood, the scent of sawdust mingling with the phantom scent of her perfume. He was starting to let himself hope, a feeling so foreign and dangerous, it was almost painful. He was at the workshop, finishing the last of the antique chairs, when the article appeared. It wasn't in a newspaper he read, or a channel he watched. It was sent to him by a well-meaning old client, a woman who followed the local business news with a hawk-like intensity. The subject line was, "Isn't this your friend?" Liam clicked the link, and his world tilted on its axis. The headline was bold. Vale Industries CEO Catherine Vale pledges record, breaking donation to City Arts program. And there she was. A picture of Catherine, not in the soft sweaters and jeans he knew, but in a sharp, tailored power suit, standing at a podium, her expression confident and commanding. Behind her, the Vale Industries logo, a sleek, stylized vase, projected onto a screen. Vale, the name of the community center, the name of the foundation that funded the Light Festival, the name on the bronze plaque in Maya's school. He read the article, his heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. It detailed her corporate triumphs, her family's staggering wealth, her reputation as one of the most powerful and private executives in the country. It called her the Iron Queen of Commerce, a woman known for her ruthless business acumen and her impenetrable privacy. It was like reading about a stranger who had sat on the floor of his workshop, a stranger who had held his hand, a stranger who he had started to fall for. A cold dread seeped into him. The bookshelf, the deposit, the tickets, were they just casual acts of charity from a woman for whom that kind of money meant nothing? Was he a project? A quaint little carpenter she'd stumbled upon, a brief rustic diversion from her world of boardrooms and billions? He felt like a fool. The trust he had so cautiously, so hesitantly begun to build crumbled into dust. He looked around his workshop, at the worn tools and half-finished projects, at the life he had cobbled together with his own 2 hands. It had felt honest. It had felt real. Now, seen through the lens of her immense wealth, it just felt small, pathetic. He heard Maya humming in her corner office, completely oblivious, and a protective anger flared in his chest. He had let this woman into their world, into their lives. He had let his daughter grow to love her. The phone rang. Her name flashed on the screen. For a moment, he stared at it, his thumb hovering over the green button. Then, with a resolve as cold and hard as steel, he declined the call. He declined the next one, too. He wasn't a project. He wasn't a charity case. And he would not let his daughter become one either. The wall around his heart, the one that had just begun to crumble, was now being rebuilt, brick by painful brick. Catherine sat in her office on the 40th floor, the city skyline sprawling beneath her like a map of her own creation. The room was a study in minimalist luxury glass, steel, and muted grays. It was silent, the kind of engineered silence that cost a fortune to achieve. But today, the silence was deafening. He wasn't answering. She'd called him twice, then sent a text, "Thinking of you. Hope you're having a good day," that had remained unanswered, the single word "delivered" mocking her from the screen. She knew what had happened. The article had gone live this morning. Her PR team was thrilled. Her father had called, a rare occurrence, to grunt his approval. The donation was a strategic success, a perfect blend of philanthropy and brand enhancement. To Catherine, it felt like a disaster. She swiveled in her leather chair, her gaze falling on the small, perfectly crafted bookshelf that now stood in the corner of her office. It was the only thing in the room that felt real, the only object that held a story she cared about. She'd run a hand over its smooth surface a dozen times that morning, as if the feel of the wood could somehow bridge the distance between this sterile office and his dusty workshop. She knew what he must be thinking. She'd seen the guarded pride in his eyes from the very beginning. He was a man who built his world with his own two hands, who measured his worth in the honesty of his labor. And she, in his eyes, had likely just revealed herself as a liar. She hadn't lied, not explicitly. But the omission felt like a betrayal now, a gaping hole in the fragile trust they had built. She had been so careful to keep her two worlds separate. The world of Catherine Vale, CEO, and the world of Catherine, the woman who sat on a concrete floor with a little girl and felt, for the first time in years, like she was home. She hadn't wanted him to see the CEO. She had wanted him to see her. But the world didn't allow for such distinctions. The phone on her desk buzzed, her assistant's voice coming through the intercom. "Ms. Vale, Mr. Henderson is here, for your 2 o'clock. Catherine closed her eyes. "Mr. Henderson." A meeting about a third-quarter logistics merger. Numbers, projections, strategies. The familiar rhythm of her life. "Tell him I'll be there in a moment," she said, her voice flat. She stood and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking down at the city below. From up here, people looked like ants, their lives small and insignificant. For the past few weeks, she had been on the ground, living a life that felt significant in its smallness. She'd traded boardrooms for a workshop, spreadsheets for sawdust, and corporate applause for a child's unfiltered laughter. And now, standing in the glass tower she had built, she had never felt more trapped or more alone. She had found something real, and she was terrified she had just destroyed it. Days turned into a week into 2. The silence from Liam was absolute, a solid, unbreachable wall. He didn't answer her calls, didn't reply to her texts. Catherine tried to stop by the workshop once, but the closed sign was hanging in the window, and the building was dark and still, even though she could see his truck parked around back. It was a clear message. "You are not welcome here." She threw herself back into her work with a vengeance, a desperate attempt to drown out the quiet ache in her chest. She chaired meetings with her old, sharp efficiency, dissected reports with ruthless precision, and made decisions that added millions to the company's bottom line. Her board was pleased. Her father was impressed. Everyone told her she was back, better than ever. But she was just performing. Every night she would come home to her sprawling, empty penthouse, the silence of the rooms, a stark contrast to the memory of Maya's chatter and the sound of Liam's quiet, steady work. She'd find herself standing in front of the bookshelf he'd made, tracing the lines of the wood grain with her fingers, the scent of varnish and honesty, a ghost in the pristine air. She was the Iron Queen again, just as the articles said, but her throne felt cold, and her kingdom felt empty. Meanwhile, Liam was drowning in his own silence. He took on any job he could get, no matter how small, working late into the night. The workshop, once his sanctuary, now felt like a prison. Every corner held a memory of her. The spot on the floor where she'd sat with Maya, the workbench where they'd lifted the heavy slab together, the faint, sweet smell of the coffee she used to bring. He was exhausted, his body aching from the long hours, his heart aching from a loss he refused to name. He was short-tempered and distant, and Maya felt it. The light in her had dimmed. She stopped asking about Catherine, her name becoming a forbidden word in their small two-person world, but she drew pictures of her. Liam would find them tucked into her school books or lying on her desk, a woman with long hair and a kind smile, often standing beside a man and a little girl. One evening, as he was tucking her into bed, Maya looked up at him, her eyes wide and serious in the dim light of her bedside lamp. "Is Daddy sad because the fancy lady went away?" she asked, her voice a small, hesitant whisper. Liam's throat tightened. He sat on the edge of her bed, the mattress dipping under his weight. He couldn't lie to her. "Yeah, Sprout," he said, his voice rough. "Daddy's a little sad." "Why did she go away?" He didn't have an answer for that, not a real one. Because I was scared? Because I was proud? Because her world is too big and ours is too small? None of those felt right. "It's complicated," he said, the old useless excuse of adults. Maya considered this for a moment, then reached out and patted his hand. "You can fix it, Daddy," she said with the simple, unwavering faith of a child. "You can fix anything." But as he walked out of her room and into the quiet darkness of the apartment, Liam wasn't so sure. This was one thing, he feared, that was broken beyond his repair. The phone call came on a Tuesday, a day that was already gray and heavy with the promise of rain. It was from the school. Liam's heart lurched, the immediate panic of a single parent flashing through him. But it wasn't an emergency. It was the principal, a kind woman with a perpetually worried expression. "Mr. Calloway," she began, her voice hesitant. "There's a matter I need to discuss with you concerning Maya's tuition." Liam's stomach sank. He knew he was behind. He'd been trying to catch up, but a series of unexpected repairs on the truck had wiped out what little savings he had. The private school had been his late wife's dream for Maya, a place with small classes and dedicated teachers, and he'd fought tooth and nail to keep her there. "I know I'm late on the last payment," he said, his voice tight with a mixture of shame and defensiveness. "I was planning to drop off a check on Friday." "That's just it, Mr. Kind. Calloway," the principal said, and he could hear the confusion in her tone. "Your account? It's been paid. In full. For the rest of the year." Liam was silent. He couldn't have heard her right. Paid? By who? Well, that's the strange part. It was an anonymous donation, made through a corporate philanthropy program. All the paperwork says is that it was designated specifically for Maya to ensure her continued enrollment. A corporate philanthropy program. The words hit Liam like a physical blow. He didn't have to ask. He knew. There was only one person he knew who could make a phone call and erase a debt like it was a smudge on a window. He ended the call, his hand trembling as he set the phone down. It wasn't relief he felt. It was a cold, quiet rage. She was doing it again. Reaching into his life with her money, fixing his problems without asking, treating him like a charity case who couldn't manage his own affairs. It was everything he had feared. He paced the floor of his workshop, a caged animal, the scent of sawdust suddenly suffocating. This was her power. She could move mountains with a checkbook, solve problems he bled for with a simple directive, and it made him feel powerless. He wanted to call her, to yell, to tell her to take her money and her pity and stay out of his life. But what would that accomplish? It would only prove what she probably already thought, that he was an angry, proud man who couldn't provide for his own daughter. He sank onto a stool, burying his face in his hands. The worst part was, he needed it. He needed the help. And that, more than anything, was what broke him. She had backed him into a corner where his pride and his daughter's future were at odds, and he hated her for it. But somewhere, under the anger and the humiliation, a small, treacherous part of him whispered a different truth. She didn't have to do it. She could have walked away and never looked back. But she didn't. She was still watching over them, even from a distance. And that thought was more confusing and more painful than the anger itself. Catherine's days were a blur of calculated decisions. She moved through her life with the precision of a surgeon, her schedule mapped out in 15-minute increments. She finalized the logistics merger with Henderson, acquired a smaller tech firm, and gave a keynote speech at a Women in Business conference that earned a standing ovation. She was the epitome of success, a portrait of control, but it was an illusion. At night, the control unraveled. She would sit in her vast, silent living room, a glass of expensive wine untouched on the table beside her, and stare at the city lights. She had arranged the tuition payment for Maya through 3 separate shell foundations, a maneuver so complex and anonymous that not even her own CFO could trace it back to her. It was a desperate, clumsy attempt to help, in the only way she knew how. She told herself it was for the child, to ensure her stability, to ease one of Liam's burdens. But she knew it was also for her. It was a lifeline, a way to maintain a connection, however phantom, to the only people who had made her feel real in years. She missed the smell of his workshop. She missed the earnest, serious way Maya would explain the world. She missed the weight of Liam's hand in hers. One evening, her assistant buzzed her on the intercom. "Ms. Vale, a package was just delivered for you. It's unusual. There's no return address. Bring it in," Catherine said, her curiosity piqued. The package was a small, square cardboard box, taped clumsily. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, was a small, hand-carved wooden bird. It was simple, almost childlike in its design, but the craftsmanship was unmistakable. The lines were clean, the wood sanded to a satin finish, the tiny details of its feathers etched with a loving, patient hand. It was Liam's work. There was no note, nothing else in the box. Just the bird. Catherine held it in the palm of her hand, its smooth, light weight, a stark contrast to the heavy ache in her chest. It wasn't a thank you, she knew him well enough for that. It wasn't forgiveness either, it was something more complex. A message, an acknowledgement. It was him saying, "I know it was you, and this is all I am willing to give you in return." It was him showing her that he couldn't be bought, that his pride and his craft were his own, and that they were not for sale. She closed her hand around the bird, its wooden form a solid, tangible piece of his world, in the middle of her sterile one. Tears, she hadn't realized she was holding back, stung her eyes. He hadn't yelled. He hadn't rejected the money. He had simply responded with the one thing that was entirely his to give, his art. And in that quiet, beautiful, and heartbreaking gesture, Catherine knew the chasm between them had just grown wider. He didn't want her help. He wanted her to understand. And she was beginning to realize she had no idea how to do that. The wooden bird sat on Catherine's desk, a silent, beautiful accusation. It was a constant reminder of the world she had touched and then broken. Every time she glanced at it, she didn't see a gift. She saw a boundary line he had drawn in the sand. She had offered him power, in the form of money, and he had responded with art, with something pure that her money couldn't create. He was showing her in the quietest way possible that they spoke different languages. Frustration and a deep, unfamiliar helplessness began to gnaw at her. She was a problem solver. She dismantled complex corporate structures, navigated hostile takeovers, and built empires. But she couldn't figure out how to fix this, how to fix them. Her life, once a model of efficiency, became chaotic. She was distracted in meetings, her mind drifting to a dusty workshop. She snapped at her assistant, then apologized profusely. She canceled a trip to Zurich at the last minute, offering no explanation. Her world, once so firmly under her control, was beginning to fray at the edges, and the bird on her desk was the epicenter of the quake. One rainy afternoon, driven by an impulse she couldn't explain, she left the office and drove. She didn't have a destination. She just let the car move through the city, the windshield wipers keeping a steady, hypnotic rhythm. She found herself in a part of town she hadn't visited in years, a neighborhood of old brick buildings and independent shops. She parked and walked, the rain soaking the shoulders of her expensive coat. She passed a bookstore, a bakery, and then she stopped. It was a small art gallery, its window displaying the work of local artisans. Pottery, paintings, and there, in the center, on a simple pedestal, was a collection of hand-carved wooden animals. She knew the style instantly. She stepped inside. The gallery was quiet, save for the soft murmur of a few patrons. The owner, An older woman with kind eyes and paint-stained fingers greeted her with a warm smile. "Can I help you?" Catherine walked toward the display, her heart pounding. "The wood carvings," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Who is the artist?" "Oh, that's Liam Calloway," the owner said, her face lighting up. "A wonderful man, incredibly talented. A single father, raising the sweetest little girl. He's been struggling lately, like so many artists. But his work, it just has so much heart, doesn't it?" Catherine couldn't speak. She just nodded, her throat tight. She looked at the small price tags beside each piece. They were shockingly low, a fraction of what they were worth. He was practically giving his art away. "He brings new pieces in every few weeks," the owner continued, oblivious to Catherine's turmoil. "Says he just wants them to find a good home." Catherine looked at a carving of a fox, its head tilted with a curious, lifelike expression. This was his world. Honest, beautiful, and undervalued, and she had stormed into it with all the grace of a corporate takeover. She hadn't been trying to help him. She'd been trying to fit him into her world, to solve him like a business problem, and that was why she had failed. She turned and left the gallery without a word, the bell above the door chiming softly behind her. The rain was falling harder now, but she didn't notice. For the first time, she wasn't thinking about what she could give him. She was thinking about what she needed to learn from him. Liam felt like he was living in a ghost story. Her presence was everywhere and nowhere. He'd see a black car pass the workshop, and his heart would leap, only to settle into disappointment when it kept driving. Maya would mention the fancy lady in a quiet, hopeful tone, and he'd have to change the subject, the lie of omission tasting like ash in his mouth. He was working, but the joy was gone. The craft that had once been his salvation now felt like a chore. He finished the antique chairs, and the client was thrilled, but the payment felt hollow. It wasn't enough. Nothing was ever enough. The notice from the landlord was a final one this time. The building that housed his workshop had been sold to a new development company. He had 30 days to vacate. The news was a death sentence. The workshop was more than a building. It was his history, his identity. It was the last place that felt like his own. He spent days searching for a new space, but everything was too expensive, too small, too far away. The city was changing, pushing out the small, independent craftsmen like him in favor of glass and steel condos and trendy cafes. He was an antique in a modern world, and he was being priced out of existence. He didn't tell Maya. He couldn't. How could? He explained that the place she thought of as a second home, the place where she'd spent countless hours coloring and creating while he worked, was being taken away? How could he add that fear to the quiet sadness she was already carrying? He sat alone in the workshop late one night, the single bare bulb overhead casting long, lonely shadows. He was surrounded by the tools of his trade, the smell of his life's work, and he felt a despair so profound it was a physical weight. He had nothing left. His pride had cost him the one person who had offered a hand, and now the world was closing in, ready to take the little he had left. He picked up a block of wood, the knife in his hand feeling foreign, clumsy. He started to carve, not with a plan, but with a desperate need to create something, to feel like he could still make something whole. He carved the shape of a woman's face, her expression quiet and sad. He carved until his hands ached and the sun began to rise, and when he was done, he looked at the piece in his hand and saw not just Catherine, but his own foolish, broken heart. He had shut her out to protect his world, and in doing so he had lost it anyway. The silence that followed was the sound of utter defeat. Catherine made a decision. It was quiet, it was terrifying, and it was entirely her own. She called an emergency meeting of her board. They gathered in the sterile conference room, their faces a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. They expected a new strategy, a new acquisition, a new projection for the next fiscal year. They were not prepared for what she said. "I'm dissolving the Vale Family Foundation," she began, her voice calm and clear. Gasps rippled through the room. The foundation was her father's legacy, a corporate titan of philanthropy that managed hundreds of millions of dollars. In its place, she continued, I'm establishing a new endowment, a smaller one. It will be called the Artisans' Trust. She paused, letting the words sink in. Its sole purpose will be to provide grants, workshop spaces, and resources for local, independent craftspeople. The artists who are being pushed out by urban development, the ones who work with their hands, who preserve traditions, who create beauty that can't be mass-produced. Her father's oldest friend, a man who had been on the board since its inception, stood up. Catherine, this is madness. You're dismantling a legacy to fund carpenters and potters? Yes, she said, meeting his gaze without flinching. I am. Because I've learned that a legacy built on bronze plaques and gala dinners is hollow. Real value isn't in the stock price, it's in the things that are made with heart. It's in supporting the people who make our world beautiful, not just profitable. She didn't wait for their approval. She didn't need it anymore. She had spent her life playing their game, living by their rules. Now, she was creating her own. Later that day, she made another call, this time to a real estate agent who specialized in commercial properties in the older, industrial parts of the city. I'm looking for a building, she said. Something with character, good light, something that feels like it has a story. As she spoke, her eyes fell on the small, carved bird on her desk. She wasn't just buying a building, she was trying to build a bridge made of something more solid than money, a bridge made of understanding. She didn't know if he would cross it. She didn't even know if he would see it. But for the first time in her life, she was acting not from a place of power or strategy, but from a place of hope. And that felt more real and more terrifying than any boardroom ever had. The letter arrived on a Saturday morning, tucked into the mail slot of the workshop door. It was a simple, cream-colored envelope with no name, just the address. Liam assumed it was another bill, another warning. He almost threw it away without opening it. But Maya, who was helping him pack tools into boxes, saw it and brought it to him. Maybe it's good news, Daddy, she said, her voice small and hopeful. He tore it open with a sigh, his expectations low. The letterhead was simple, the Artisans' Trust. His eyes scanned the text, his brain struggling to process the words. Dear Mr. Calloway, you have been anonymously nominated and selected as the inaugural recipient of a legacy grant from the Artisans' Trust. This grant includes the full acquisition of a new, permanent workshop space for your business, Calloway Woodworks, at the historic waterfront property located at 12 Dock Street. The property has been paid for in full. All utilities and property taxes will be covered for a period of 5 years to allow you to focus on your craft. Liam read it 3 times. It didn't make sense. It was a fantasy, a dream. A new workshop? On the waterfront? Paid for? He sank onto a packing box, the letter trembling in his hand. Anonymous nomination. He knew who it was. But this was different from the school tuition. This wasn't a problem being fixed. This was a future being offered. It wasn't charity, it was an investment in his art, in his life's work. The letter included a key and a simple, hand-drawn map. He stared at it for a long moment, his heart a wild, chaotic drum in his chest. What is it, Daddy? Maya asked, peering over his shoulder. He looked at her wide, trusting eyes, and for the first time in weeks, a real, unforced smile touched his lips. I think, he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name, it might be good news. They drove to Dock Street, the old truck rattling past warehouses and shipping yards. The building was at the end of a cobblestone pier, an old brick structure with huge arched windows that overlooked the water. It was beautiful, full of the kind of character and history he thought no longer existed. He used the key. The lock turned smoothly. He pushed the heavy wooden door open, and they stepped inside. The space was vast, flooded with the soft gray light from the massive windows. The air smelled of salt, old wood, and possibility. It was empty, a blank canvas. In the center of the floor, alone, sat a single object. A perfectly crafted bookshelf, the one he had made for her. On the top shelf was a small, carved wooden bird, and beside it, a note. Just one word. Please. Liam walked toward it, his steps echoing in the vast, quiet space. Maya ran ahead, her hands outstretched, spinning in the light. He picked up the note, the single word, a plea, an apology, and an invitation all at once. He looked around the empty workshop, at the light, at the water, at his daughter dancing. She hadn't fixed his old world. She had built him a new one that was big enough for both of them. Liam stood in the center of the new workshop, the note still clutched in his hand. The word please was written in her elegant, familiar script. It was a word he never would have associated with the powerful, poised woman he thought he knew. It was a word that spoke of vulnerability, of hope, of a quiet desperation that mirrored his own. He looked at the bookshelf, his own craftsmanship standing as a testament to the beginning of their story. He looked at the bird she had left, a symbol of the message he had sent, now returned to him as an olive branch. He was a man who understood things made of wood and steel, things with clear lines and purposes. Feelings were a more difficult terrain, full of hidden knots and unpredictable grain. He had let his pride and his fear build a wall between them. He had assumed her act of kindness was pity, because it was easier than admitting he might be worthy of something more. It was easier to believe their worlds were incompatible than to be brave enough to try and merge them. Maya stopped spinning and ran to him, grabbing his hand. "Is this our new home, Daddy?" she asked, her voice echoing in the huge, empty space. He looked down at her, then around the room, at the light pouring in, at the endless possibility held within these old brick walls. "Yeah. Sprout," he said, his voice husky. "This is it." He knew what he had to do. It wasn't about pride anymore. It wasn't about fear. It was about acknowledging a truth he had tried to deny. She saw him not as a project, not as a charity case, but as a man, an artist, a father. And she had respected him enough not to fix his problems, but to give him a space where he could fix them himself. He pulled out his phone, his fingers surprisingly steady as he scrolled to her name. He hadn't deleted it. He'd hovered over the delete button 100 times, but could never bring himself to do it. He pressed the call button and held the phone to his ear, his heart pounding a steady, hopeful rhythm. He didn't know what he would say. He didn't have a plan. But for the first time, he was willing to work without one. He was ready to step into the unknown, to meet her halfway on the bridge she had so carefully, so beautifully built for him. She answered on the second ring. Her hello was quiet, tentative, laced with an uncertainty that told him she had been waiting, hoping. "It's me," Liam said, his voice rougher than he intended. He could hear her sharp intake of breath on the other end, a small, hopeful gasp. Liam. She said his name like it was a prayer she hadn't dared to speak aloud. There was a long pause, filled with the weight of all the things they hadn't said. "I'm at the workshop," he said finally. "The new one." "Oh," was all she said. "You got the letter." "I got it." He walked toward the massive windows, looking out at the gray water of the harbor. "Why?" It was the only question that mattered. "Because," she started, her voice trembling slightly, "because I realized I had been trying to use my world to fix yours, and that was wrong. Your world, your work, it isn't broken. It's beautiful. I just wanted to give it a space big enough for it to breathe." Her words were a balm on the raw, bruised parts of his pride. She understood. She finally, truly understood. "Catherine," he said, and he didn't know what he was going to say next, but he needed to say something to close the distance her honesty had just erased. "I'm not a man who's good with words. I build things. That's how I talk." "I know," she whispered. "I've been a fool," he admitted, the confession costing him everything and freeing him completely. "I let my pride get in the way. I was scared." "I'm sorry." "Don't be sorry," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I was scared too. I still am." He closed his eyes, leaning his forehead against the cool glass of the window. Can you come here?" Another pause, and then, "I'm already on my way." He didn't know how long he waited. It could have been 10 minutes or an hour. Time seemed to have stretched and warped the world, narrowing to this one space, this one moment of anticipation. Maya had found a pile of wood shavings in a corner and was happily making what she called sawdust angels on the floor. Then he heard it, the soft click of the heavy door opening. He turned. She stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the bright afternoon light. She wore a simple gray coat, her hair pulled back, her face free of makeup. She looked vulnerable and strong all at once. Her eyes, wide and searching, found his across the vast room. She took a hesitant step inside, then another. She didn't speak. He didn't either. They just looked at each other, letting the silence say everything words couldn't. He started walking toward her, his boots echoing on the wide planked floor. She met him in the middle, in a patch of sunlight that streamed down from a high window. When they were finally face to face, she reached out, not to touch him, but to gently place her palm on his chest, right over his heart. "Hi," she whispered. "Hi," he breathed back. And then he closed the small space between them, his hand coming up to cup her cheek, his thumb gently stroking her skin. It wasn't a desperate, hurried gesture. It was slow, deliberate, a question and an answer all in one. He leaned in and kissed her, and it was a kiss that tasted of forgiveness, of second chances, of two broken pieces finally finding their way home. The first few weeks in the new workshop were a symphony of creation. The vast space, which had once felt intimidatingly empty, was now filled with the hum of saws, the scent of fresh-cut pine, and the sound of Maya's laughter echoing off the high ceilings. Liam worked with a renewed sense of purpose, his hands moving with the easy confidence of a man who had been given back his soul. The light that poured through the massive windows seemed to energize him, the view of the water, a constant, calming presence. Catherine was there, not every day, but most. She didn't direct or manage. She participated. She'd arrive in jeans and an old sweater, her hair tied back in a messy bun, and would simply ask, "What can I do?" She learned to sweep sawdust into neat piles. She learned to organize his tools, painstakingly arranging wrenches and chisels on a newly built rack. She learned to sand, her manicured hands growing accustomed to the feel of the wood, her movements at first clumsy, then more sure. Liam would watch her, a slow smile often playing on his lips. He was teaching her his language, the language of building things with patience and care. In return, she taught him hers. Not the language of boardrooms, but the language of trust. She was open with him about her work, her family, the pressures of her world. She would take calls in the small office they had built in the corner, and he would hear her voice, firm and commanding, and he no longer felt intimidated. He felt proud. He saw the woman who could command an empire, and the woman who could get sawdust in her hair, and he realized they were the same person. She was strong, and she was soft. She was powerful, and she was vulnerable. One afternoon, he found her staring out the window at the harbor, a thoughtful, distant look on her face. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, coming to stand beside her. She leaned her head on his shoulder. "I was just thinking about how I spent my whole life building things that were empty," she said softly. "Glass towers, corporate strategies, a public image, and all I ever wanted was this." "This?" he asked, wrapping an arm around her. "A dusty room with a nice view?" She turned to face him, a serious, loving light in her eyes. "No, a place to build something real. With you." The words settled between them, comfortable and true. He didn't need to answer. She already knew. Maya ran up to them then, holding a small, lopsided wooden boat she had been helping Liam with. "Look, it floats," she declared, pointing to a bucket of water where the boat was in fact floating. Catherine knelt, examining the boat with the same serious attention she would give a corporate merger. "It's a masterpiece," she said. Maya beamed. "Daddy and I built it. You can help with the next one." "I'd love that," Catherine said, her eyes meeting Liam's over the top of Maya's head. And in that simple moment, with the smell of sawdust in the air and a lopsided boat floating in a bucket, the three of them were no longer two separate worlds. They were a family, building their future, one piece of wood at a time. The grand opening of Callaway Vale wasn't a grand affair. There were no reporters, no velvet ropes, no corporate sponsors. The invitations were simple, hand-printed cards that Catherine and Maya had decorated with glitter. The guests were a mix of Liam's old clients, Catherine's bewildered but supportive few real friends, the owner of the small art gallery, and a handful of local artisans who had become the first recipients of the Artisans' Trust. The workshop was aglow with strings of warm fairy lights that Catherine had insisted on, their soft light reflecting off the polished surfaces of Liam's finished work. Tables were laden not with champagne and caviar, but with cider, donuts, and a massive pot of chili that Liam had made. People mingled, their voices a happy, genuine buzz. They admired the furniture, the view, the sheer, breathtaking beauty of the space. Liam stood near the entrance, a cup of cider in his hand, watching it all unfold. He wore a new shirt, but it was still flannel. He was still himself, but he was different too. The guarded, weary tension that had lived in his shoulders for so long was gone, replaced by a quiet, steady confidence. Catherine moved through the crowd with an effortless grace, her smile warm and real. She introduced her high-powered friends to Liam's salt-of-the-earth clients, finding common ground where none should have existed. She wasn't performing. She was connecting. She was home. Later in the evening, when the crowd had thinned, she found him standing by the windows, looking out at the dark water. "You did it," she said, slipping her hand into his. "You built all of this." He shook his head, turning to her. "No," he said, his voice low and full of an emotion that still felt new. "We built it." He pulled her closer, his other hand coming up to gently brush a stray piece of glitter from her cheek. "I love you, Catherine Vale. I love you, Liam Callaway," she whispered, her eyes shining in the soft light. Maya, who was supposed to be asleep on a cot in the office, chose that moment to appear, holding the small carved bird he had made for Catherine. "I think the bird needs a nest," she announced, her voice full of sleepy importance. Liam and Catherine both laughed, the sound mingling with the soft music and the gentle lapping of the water against the pier. He lifted his daughter into his arms, and the three of them stood there, framed by the light of the workshop, a strange, beautiful, and perfectly imperfect family. They had come from two different worlds, two different stories, but they had found each other. And in the heart of the city, in a workshop filled with sawdust and hope, they had built a new world, one that was strong enough for all of them. Years later, the workshop on Dock Street had become a landmark. It was known not just for the exquisite craftsmanship of the furniture that came out of it, but as a hub of creativity, a sanctuary for artists funded by the Artisans' Trust, which Catherine ran with a quiet, fierce dedication. The name Callaway Vale had become synonymous with integrity, quality, and the idea that business could be a force for good. On a warm summer evening, Liam and Catherine sat on a bench outside the workshop, watching the sunset paint the sky in strokes of orange and pink. The sounds from inside were a familiar comfort, the buzz of a sander, the low murmur of conversation, the occasional burst of laughter. Liam's hands, though still calloused, were no longer perpetually stained with grease and worry. They were often laced with Catherine's, a comfortable, practiced fit. A teenage Maya emerged from the workshop, her hair tied up, a smudge of paint on her cheek. She had her father's hands and her mother's discerning eye, and she spent most of her free time in the shop, creating pieces of her own. "I'm heading out with friends," she said, kissing them both on the cheek. "Don't wait up!" They watched her go, her confident stride a testament to the stable, loving world they had built for her. "Remember that first play?" Liam asked, his voice soft. "Tree, number 3. Catherine smiled, leaning her head on his shoulder. I remember a man in the back row who looked like he was watching the most important thing in the universe. I was? He said simply. I still am. He looked at her, at the woman who had dismantled her empire to help him build his, the woman who had traded glass towers for brick walls, who had shown him that love wasn't about fixing what was broken, but about building something new together. The world still saw her as Catherine Vale, the powerful businesswoman, but he saw her as Kate, the woman who still couldn't make coffee properly but who could tie a perfect ribbon on a birthday gift, the woman who loved the smell of sawdust and the sound of the water at high tide. A young couple, aspiring furniture makers, who had just received a grant from the trust, approached them hesitantly. "Mr. Calloway, Miss Vale?" the young man asked. "We just wanted to thank you. You've given us a chance we never thought we'd have." Catherine smiled warmly. "Liam is the one to thank," she said, squeezing his hand. "He's the one who taught me what it means to build something that lasts." Liam just nodded, a quiet pride settling in his chest. As the couple walked away, filled with the same hope he had once felt, he looked at his wife, her face bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. Their story wasn't a fairy tale of a rich woman saving a poor man. It was a story of two lonely people who had saved each other, who had learned that the strongest structures are built not on foundations of money or power, but on the simple, unshakable ground of love and respect. And their legacy wasn't in the buildings they owned or the company they ran. It was in the light, in a young artist's eyes, in their daughter's confident laughter, and in the quiet, profound peace of watching the sunset from a bench they had built with their own two hands. The request was unusual, but Liam didn't hesitate. A small local museum dedicated to the city's maritime history was putting together an exhibit on traditional craftsmanship, and they wanted to feature his work. Specifically, they wanted to film him in his workshop, to capture the process, the environment, the story behind the art. Liam, who still shied away from any kind of spotlight, was about to decline, but Catherine had convinced him. "Your work deserves to be seen," she'd said. "Your story deserves to be told." So, on a bright Tuesday morning, a small, quiet film crew set up their equipment in a corner of the workshop. They were respectful, moving around the space with a reverence that put Liam at ease. He worked on a new piece, a rocking chair carved from a single piece of reclaimed cherry wood, his hands moving with the familiar, practiced grace that was second nature to him. Catherine sat in the small office, working on her laptop, occasionally glancing out at him with a proud, loving smile. Maya, home from school, was in her own corner, sketching designs in a notebook, the sounds of the workshop, the constant, comforting music of her childhood. The interviewer, a young woman with a soft voice and intelligent eyes, asked him questions as he worked. She asked about his technique, about the types of wood he preferred, about the history of the tools he used, many of which had been his grandfather's. Then she shifted her line of questioning. "Your wife," she said, "Catherine Vale. The world knows her as a titan of industry." It was a surprise to many when she stepped back from her family's company to start the Artisans' Trust. What is it like, being married to a woman with such a powerful public persona? Liam didn't stop his work. He continued to draw a spokeshave along the curve of the chair's leg, the wood curling away in a perfect, fragrant ribbon. He thought for a moment not of the CEO, but of the woman who made lopsided pancakes and who still sometimes tripped over the step into the office. "The world knows one version of her," he said, his voice low and steady, the microphone picking up the soft scrape of his tool against the wood. "I know the real one. I know the woman who sees the story in a piece of old wood. The one who believes in people, not in pedigrees. The one who taught me that your past doesn't have to be your future." He paused, setting the tool down and running his hand over the smooth, warm wood. "People talk about our different worlds, but they don't see that she's the one who built this one. Not with her money, but with her heart. She didn't save me from my life. She showed me how big it could be." He looked up, his gaze finding Catherine through the office window. She was watching him, tears shining in her eyes. He gave her a small, slow smile, a private message that the camera couldn't possibly capture. The interviewer was silent for a moment, seemingly moved. "One last question," she said. "If you could give one piece of advice to a young artisan starting out, someone who feels like the world doesn't value their work, what would it be?" Liam picked up his tool again. "I'd tell them to build what's true," he said. "Don't worry about the market or the trends. Just make what is honest. Make what has heart. The right people will find it." And as he went back to his work, the camera still rolling, the light pouring in from the massive windows, it was clear to everyone in the room that he wasn't just talking about wood. The exhibit opened on a cool evening in early fall. The museum was a small, elegant space, its white walls a perfect canvas for the art it held. In the center of the main room, under a soft spotlight, was Liam's cherry rocking chair. It sat alone on a raised platform, a masterpiece of form and function, its lines clean, its presence quiet and profound. Beside it, a small screen played a loop of the interview, his low voice filling the gallery with a quiet authority. Liam and Catherine walked through the exhibit hand in hand, Maya trailing slightly behind them, her eyes wide with a teenager's feigned indifference that couldn't quite hide her immense pride. Liam felt a familiar discomfort under the gaze of the patrons, but it was different now. It wasn't the feeling of being out of place. It was the shy vulnerability of an artist sharing his soul. People didn't look at him with confusion anymore. They looked at him with respect. They saw his work, heard his words, and understood. An elderly man approached them, his eyes fixed on the rocking chair. "It's beautiful," he said to Liam. "My grandfather used to make chairs like this. I haven't seen work this honest in 50 years. "Thank you," Liam said, his voice full of a gratitude that was deep and sincere. As the man walked away, Catherine squeezed his hand. "See?" she whispered. "The right people." Later, they stood in a quieter corner of the gallery, looking at a series of black and white photographs documenting the city's old waterfront industries. There was a photo of the very pier where their workshop now stood, taken almost a century ago. It was bustling with workers, its bricks dark with coal dust. "It's amazing how things change," Catherine murmured, her finger tracing the outline of the building in the photograph. "And how they stay the same," Liam added. "It was a place where people built things with their hands then, and it's a place where they build things with their hands now." He looked at her, his expression serious. "You did that. You preserved that." "No," she said, turning to face him. "You reminded me that it was worth preserving." A young couple, the same aspiring furniture makers from their opening night, came over to them, their faces glowing with excitement. "We sold our first piece," the woman announced. "Someone saw it at the Trust showcase and commissioned a whole dining set." "That's incredible," Catherine said, her smile genuine and radiant. As they listened to the young couple talk about their plans, their dreams now tangible and within reach, Liam looked at his wife. He saw not the Iron Queen of Commerce, but Catherine, the architect of second chances. She had taken her power, her wealth, her influence, and had transformed it into a legacy not of bronze plaques, but of sawdust, of hope, of the quiet, profound beauty of a well-made thing. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that the most beautiful thing she had ever built was the life they now shared. The package that arrived at the workshop was large, flat, and professionally wrapped. It was addressed to Liam, but he knew from the moment he saw the courier's logo that it was connected to her world. He and Catherine opened it together on the main workbench, Maya looking over their shoulders with curiosity. Inside, nestled in layers of protective foam, was a framed magazine cover. It was from a prestigious architecture and design journal. The cover photo was a stunning, artistic shot of their workshop. The massive windows were aglow with warm light against a twilight sky, the water of the harbor a deep, shimmering blue. The headline read, "The New Legacy: How the Artisans' Trust is Redefining Urban Philanthropy." But it was the sub-headline that made Liam's breath catch, featuring the work of master craftsman Liam Calloway. Master craftsman. The words felt foreign, too large for him. He had always just been a carpenter, a woodworker. Catherine traced the words on the glass with her finger, her eyes shining. "It's what you are," she said softly. "I've always known it." The article inside was a multi-page spread. It told the story of the trust, of Catherine's vision to support local artisans. But it also told his story. It featured beautiful photos of his work, of the workshop, of his hands guiding a plane over a piece of wood. It spoke of his dedication, his integrity, his uncompromising commitment to the soul of the craft. There was no mention of a blue-collar romance or a surprising pairing. The narrative wasn't about their different worlds. It was about how their shared values had created something new and beautiful. The article ended with a quote from Catherine. "People talk about ROI, return on investment, in terms of profit," she was quoted as saying. "But the real return is this. It's the preservation of beauty. It's the empowerment of talent. It's giving people the space to create work that will last for generations. That's a legacy worth building." Liam finished reading and looked at her, his heart too full for words. She had not only built a bridge between their worlds, she had redrawn the map entirely, showing everyone that they were not that different after all. Maya grabbed the frame, her face beaming with pride. "We have to hang this in the office, right at the front." As she ran off to find a hammer and nail, Liam pulled Catherine into his arms, burying his face in her hair. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick. She held him tightly. "For what? For telling the world the truth?" "For showing me," he said, pulling back to look into her eyes, "that my world was always big enough. I just needed you to see it." She smiled, a slow, radiant smile that held all the love and history of their shared journey. "It was never small, Liam," she said. "It was just quiet. And I'm so glad I learned to listen." The sun was setting, casting a warm, honey-colored glow over the water. Liam and Catherine were sitting on the edge of the pier behind the workshop, their feet dangling just above the gentle waves. The day was done, the shop was quiet, and a comfortable, familiar peace settled around them. This had become their ritual, a few moments at the end of each day, to just be together, to watch the sky change, to breathe. "Maya sold one of her sketches today," Catherine said, leaning her head on his shoulder. "The gallery owner said a collector saw it and had to have it. She's already planning how to spend the $50. Liam chuckled. "Probably on more glitter." "Probably," Catherine agreed with a soft laugh. They sat in silence for a while, watching the gulls circle overhead. The air was salty and cool, a perfect counterpoint to the warmth of her head on his shoulder. "Do you ever miss it?" he asked quietly. "The other life? The speed, the power, the 40th floor view?" She was quiet for so long he thought she hadn't heard him. Then she shifted, turning to look at him. "I don't miss the view," she said, her expression serious. "Because from up there, you can't see the details. You can't see the grain in the wood or the way the light hits the water just right. You can't see a person's hands and know their story." She reached out and took his hand, her smooth fingers lacing with his calloused ones. "I don't miss the power, because it was hollow. This," she said, her gaze sweeping over the workshop, the water, their joined hands, "this is real power, building things, helping people, loving someone. This has weight. It has meaning." Liam brought her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles. The gesture was full of a love that was deep, quiet, and unshakable. "I was so afraid of your world," he admitted. "I thought it would swallow mine whole. And I was so lost in mine," she confessed. "I'd forgotten that worlds like yours even existed. Worlds where value isn't measured in dollars, but in heart." They turned back to the sunset, the sky now a deep, bruised purple. The first star of the evening pricked the darkness. It wasn't a story of a prince and a pauper, or a queen and a commoner. It was a story of two people who had been brave enough to see past the surface, to find the shared humanity beneath. It was a story of a quiet carpenter who taught a powerful CEO the value of small, beautiful things, and a CEO who gave that carpenter a canvas big enough to share his gifts with the world. Their legacy wasn't Callaway, Vail, or the Artisan's Trust. It was in the simple, profound truth that love, when it's real, doesn't just bridge two worlds, it builds a new one. And as they sat there, hand in hand, watching the stars emerge one by one, they knew they were finally, and completely, home.